Chapter 1. The Golden Shield. In the grim expanse of the 41st millennium, where mankind's imperium stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, few warriors inspire the reverence reserved for the Adeptus Custodes. These golden guardians stand as the Emperor's own chosen, each a masterwork of genetic alchemy and unwavering devotion. For 10,000 years they have kept their vigil, their auramite armor gleaming with the light of Terra's dying sun. Yet even these paragons of duty must sometimes venture beyond the throne room's sanctity, into the galaxy's darkest corners, where their loyalty shall be tested in ways unimaginable. Shield Captain Valerian Aurelius had walked the golden halls of the Imperial Palace for 8 centuries. His armor bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, each mark a testament to battles fought in the Emperor's name. The storm bolter, mag-locked to his thigh, had spoken death to traitors on worlds whose names were forbidden to mortal tongues. His guardian spear, its power field humming with barely contained energy, had pierced the hearts of demons that lesser men could not even perceive. In the hierarchies of the 10,000, Valerian commanded respect, born not merely of rank, but of deeds that echoed through the palace's marble corridors. The astropathic message had arrived 3 days past, its psychic resonance heavy with desperation and fear. Zerion Prime, a forge world in the Ultima Segmentum, had fallen silent. No vox transmissions, no astropathic choir, no shipping manifests or tithe declarations. For a world that produced armored vehicles for 17 different Astra Militarum regiments, such silence spoke of catastrophe beyond measure. Valerian stood before the hololithic display in the custodian briefing chamber, studying the tactical readouts with the patience of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire campaigns. The golden light of the display cast sharp shadows across his aquiline features, features that had remained unchanged since his ascension to the ranks of the Custodes. Around him, his chosen brothers maintained their vigil, each a monument to human perfection, wrapped in ceramite and auramite. The Mechanicus surveillance array detected massive displacement signatures 12 hours before the silence began, reported Shield Captain Carthan, his voice carrying the weight of grim certainty. Webway breaches, multiple incursion points across the planet's surface. Valerian's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The webway, that labyrinthine dimension of corridors and passages that connected distant points across the galaxy, a realm once mastered by the Eldar, but now infested with horrors beyond counting. Few enemies possessed both the knowledge and audacity to mount a large-scale assault through those twisted paths, fewer still who would dare strike at an imperial world with such calculated precision. "Drukhari," whispered Shield Captain Theron, his scarred face bearing the marks of ancient battles fought in real space and beyond. The raiders of Comora, they move like shadows through the webway, striking where they please, taking what they desire. The hololithic display shifted, revealing grainy picked captures from Zerion Prime's orbital defense platforms, dark shapes moving through purple-tinged portals, alien skimmers loaded with screaming captives, towering monuments of flesh and bone that could only be the work of homunculi. The images flickered and died as the recording devices were destroyed, but they had seen enough. 17 million souls, Valerian said quietly, his voice carrying across the chamber like a pronouncement of judgment. Men, women, children, workers whose only crime was their service to the Imperium. They did not die quickly, brothers. That is not the Drukhari way. The assembled custodians remained silent, but Valerian could feel the cold fury radiating from each of them. They were warriors trained to face any threat, but the Drukhari represented something uniquely abhorrent. Where other enemies sought territory or resources or the glory of conquest, the Drukhari sought only suffering. They fed upon agony as others consumed bread and water, sustaining their unnatural lives through the torment of the innocent. "The High Lords have authorized a reconnaissance mission," Carthan continued, his tone carefully neutral. "Limited scope. Determine the fate of the population, assess the Xenos threat, eliminate high-value targets if the opportunity presents itself." Valerian nodded slowly. It was the kind of mission the Custodian Guard had undertaken countless times throughout the ages. Swift, surgical, decisive. Yet something about this particular deployment filled him with an uncharacteristic sense of unease. Perhaps it was the scale of the Drukhari incursion, or the complete absence of survivors from a world that should have been able to mount significant resistance. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of responsibility that came with leading the Emperor's finest into the realm of nightmare. "I will take 3 shield companies," Valerian decided, his strategic mind already calculating vectors and contingencies. "Enough force to handle significant resistance, but small enough to move quickly through the webway passages. We strike hard, gather intelligence, and withdraw before they can organize a coordinated response." The briefing concluded with the efficient precision that marked all custodian operations. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Route calculations were confirmed through the Terra-based webway gates. Communion rites were performed before the shrine of the Emperor's vigilance. Within 6 hours of receiving the mission parameters, Valerian and his chosen warriors stood ready at the webway portal deep beneath the Imperial Palace. The portal itself was a thing of impossible beauty and terrible power, its crystalline structure humming with energies that predated the rise of humanity. Ancient Eldar technology repurposed by the Emperor's genius and maintained by the most gifted tech adepts of Mars. Through this gate, Valorian and his warriors would step from Terra's sacred soil into a realm where reality bent to alien geometries, and time moved according to no law save chaos. "Remember, brothers," Valerian addressed his assembled shield host, his voice carrying clearly over the portal's harmonic resonance. "We are the Emperor's will made manifest. Whatever horrors await us in that twisted realm, whatever torments the Drukhari have prepared, we shall face them with the same courage that has sustained the Golden Throne for 10 millennia. We go not as conquerors, but as liberators. The innocent call out for salvation, and we shall answer." The portal blazed to life, its surface rippling like liquid starlight. Beyond it lay the webway, that dimension of tunnels and passages where distance held no meaning and nightmare walked freely. Valerian stepped forward, his guardian spear held ready, his storm bolter loaded with blessed ammunition. Behind him, 39 of the galaxy's finest warriors followed without hesitation, their faith in their captain absolute. The last thing Valerian saw before crossing the threshold was the golden eagle perched above the portal, its ruby eyes seeming to watch him with an intelligence both ancient and eternal. Then the webway embraced them, and they were gone from Terra's light, plunging into darkness to face whatever horrors awaited in that place where hope went to die. Yet Valerian could not shake the feeling that they were walking not into a rescue mission, but into a trap whose jaws were already beginning to close around them. In the twisted passages of the webway, something watched their approach with keen interest, something that had waited long centuries for such a prize to venture within reach. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Web of Shadows. The webway embraced them like a living thing, its crystalline passages pulsing with energies that defied mortal comprehension. Valerian led his shield host through corridors that stretched beyond sight, their auramite armor gleaming in the spectral light that emanated from the walls themselves. Here, in this dimension between dimensions, Distance became meaningless, and time flowed according to alien mathematics that had driven lesser minds to madness. The passages of Comora's outer rings revealed themselves gradually, each turn bringing fresh evidence of the dark city's malevolent architecture. Twisted spires of living bone jutted from impossible angles, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs that seemed to writhe when observed directly. The air itself carried whispers in a language that predated humanity's first steps among the stars, promises of delights that would destroy any soul foolish enough to heed their call. Shield Captain Theron raised his fist, bringing the formation to a halt. His enhanced senses had detected something ahead, a disturbance in the webway's natural flow that spoke of hostile presence. Valerian moved forward with predatory grace, his guardian spear's power field casting golden light across the passage walls. Behind him, his warriors spread into tactical formation, each custodian covering angles of approach with the precision of warriors who had drilled together for centuries. The attack came without warning, as it always did with the Drukhari. Reality tore open in a dozen places at once, purple-edged portals disgorging streams of alien raiders whose weapons blazed with dark fire. Splinter rifles spat their crystalline rounds, while dark lances carved smoking furrows through the passage walls. The air filled with the distinctive whine of Drukhari skimmers as they poured through the breaches, their crews laughing with the particular madness that came from lives sustained by the suffering of others. Valerian's storm bolter roared its answer, each bolt round finding its mark with the inevitability of divine judgment. A raider pilot's head exploded in a spray of alien blood, sending his craft spinning into the passage wall, where it detonated in a shower of metal and flesh. His guardian spear swept in wide arcs, its blade severing limbs and torsos with equal ease, the weapon's machine spirit singing hymns of destruction that echoed through the webway's twisted geometry. Around him, his shield host fought with the controlled fury that marked the Emperor's finest. Custodian Carthan's sentinel blade carved through a squad of Kabbalite warriors, each stroke precisely calculated to maximum effect. Shield Captain Theron's storm shield deflected a dark lance blast that would have vaporized a space marine, the energy dissipating across its blessed surface in cascades of harmless light. The Golden Warriors moved like a single organism, each supporting his brothers in a dance of death that had been perfected over 10 millennia of warfare. Yet for every Drukhari that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. The aliens came in waves now, their numbers apparently endless, as more portals tore open throughout the passage. Valerian realized with growing concern that this was no random raid, no opportunistic strike at perceived weakness. This was a coordinated assault, planned with meticulous care and condemned with the precision that marked the work of an Archon who had survived the treacherous politics of Comora for countless centuries. "Shield Captain," Theron's voice crackled across the vox, his words punctuated by the discharge of his storm bolter. "Movement ahead. Something large approaching through the primary passage." Valerian's enhanced vision pierced the swirling combat to see what approached through the smoke and lasfire. It was a creature of nightmare, given form, a pain engine of the homunculus covens, whose very existence was an affront to the natural order. Dozens of screaming voices were grafted across its hull, their mouths working soundlessly in eternal agony, while mechanical limbs tipped with surgical implements reached out like the arms of some twisted spider. At its center, directing its movement with the casual precision of an artist at work, sat a figure whose very presence made the air itself recoil in horror. The homunculus Xerath was ancient beyond mortal reckoning, his flesh a patchwork canvas of 1,000 different experiments in pain and modification. Where once he might have possessed the elegant beauty of the Eldar race, now only twisted purpose remained. Additional arms sprouted from his torso, each ending in a different tool of torment, while his face had been reshaped into something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of madmen. Yet his eyes burned with intelligence, undimmed by millennia of self-modification, the gaze of a mind that had unlocked secrets of flesh and spirit that no sane being should possess. "Custodians," Zerath spoke, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of battle through some trick of acoustic manipulation. "How long I have dreamed of this moment, to study the Emperor's finest, to understand what makes them so unbreakable." The pain engine lurched forward, its weapon systems targeting the Golden Warriors with malevolent precision. But it was not the creature's armaments that concerned Valyrian most. It was the strange device mounted atop its hull, a crystalline structure that pulsed with energies that seemed to drink the light from the surrounding passages. As the device powered up, Valyrian felt something he had not experienced in 8 centuries of service: weakness. The null field generator was a relic of humanity's dark age of technology, a weapon designed to suppress the very genetic modifications that elevated mankind above its baseline limitations. Zerath had spent decades perfecting its function, tuning its output specifically for the physiological enhancements that made the Custodian Guard superhuman. As its field washed over them, Valyrian felt his enhanced reflexes slow, his superhuman strength drain away like water through sand. His warriors stumbled as the field took hold, their perfect coordination faltering as enhanced senses dimmed to merely human levels. The Drukhari pressed their advantage immediately, sensing weakness like sharks scenting blood in dark waters. Splinter rounds that should have been easily dodged now found their marks, toxins burning through enhanced metabolisms that could no longer purge them with perfect efficiency. "Brothers," Valyrian commanded, his voice carrying despite the device's influence. "Fighting withdrawal, Section Tertius formation. We break contact and return to Terra." But even as he spoke, more portals blazed to life behind them, cutting off their line of retreat. The trap was complete, sprung with the patience and cunning that marked the work of an Archon who had survived the deadly intrigues of Comora for millennia. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and now fighting at a fraction of their normal capability. Custodian Lysiander fell first, a dark lance piercing his weakened armor to burn away half his torso. Shield Captain Theron followed moments later, overwhelmed by a pack of incubi whose power weapons found gaps that his dulled reflexes could no longer protect. One by one, the Emperor's finest were falling, their golden light dimming in the webway's twisted passages. Valyrian made the choice that defined him, the choice that would echo through the dark halls of Comora for years to come. Rather than fall back with his brothers, rather than preserve his own life for future battles, he stepped forward into the teeth of the enemy assault. His guardian spear blazed with power as he carved a path through the Drukhari ranks, each stroke buying precious seconds for his surviving warriors to reach the extraction point. "Go!" he roared, his voice carrying the authority of 8 centuries of command. "Return to Terra! Warn the Captain General!" The remaining custodians hesitated, their every instinct screaming against abandoning their captain to the mercy of aliens. But duty compelled them, and duty was stronger than sentiment. They fought their way to the portal that would carry them home, leaving behind the Golden Warrior who had chosen sacrifice over survival. Valyrian stood alone now, surrounded by hundreds of Drukhari raiders whose weapons were trained upon him with eager anticipation. His armor was cracked, his guardian spear's power field flickering as its energy reserves ran low. The null field generator continued its malevolent work, keeping him at merely mortal levels of capability. Yet still, he stood defiant, his aquiline features set in an expression of absolute determination. "Magnificent," Zerath whispered, his mechanical appendages clicking together in appreciation. "Simply magnificent. Do you see, Archon? Do you see what we have won this day?" From the shadows stepped another figure, this one bearing the elaborate armor and ceremonial weapons that marked him as one of Commorrag's ruling elite. Archon Vexthul of the Cabal of the Severed Chain moved with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known defeat, his pale features twisted into an expression of cruel satisfaction. "I see a prize beyond measure, Homunculus," Vexthul replied, his voice carrying the cultured tones of nobility warped by millennia of depravity. "One of the Emperor's own custodians, delivered into our hands by his own noble stupidity." Valerian raised his guardian spear one final time, its blade catching the spectral light of the webway in a last blaze of defiant gold. Around him, the Drukhari closed in like wolves around a wounded stag, their weapons ready to deliver stunning charges rather than ending blows. They wanted him alive, he realized. They wanted him conscious and aware for whatever torments they had planned. The last thing Valerian saw before the neural disruptors took hold was the face of Zerath, studying him with the intense fascination of a scholar who had just discovered a new species of insect to pin to his collection board. Then darkness claimed him, and the most perfect warrior of the most perfect army in the galaxy became a prisoner in the realm where hope went to die. The hunt had ended. The real test was about to begin. Chapter 3. The courts of anguish consciousness returned to Valerian like a tide of molten lead, each sensation bringing with it fresh awareness of his circumstances. The air tasted of copper and ozone, carrying undertones of chemical preservatives, and something else, something that spoke to the deepest, most primitive parts of his mind with warnings of danger beyond comprehension. His enhanced physiology fought against restraints that held him suspended in a cocoon of alien alloys, each movement sending tremors through bonds designed to hold beings far stronger than baseline humanity. The chamber in which he found himself defied rational description. Walls of living bone stretched upward into shadows that seemed to drink the light from bioluminescent panels embedded in their surfaces. Surgical instruments, whose purposes belonged in the fevered nightmares of madmen, hung from crystalline supports, each blade and probe gleaming with an eagerness that transcended mere metal. The floor beneath was a mosaic of different materials: polished stone, sections of what might once have been human skin, and patches of a substance that pulsed with its own hideous life. Yet it was not the chamber itself that commanded Valerian's attention, but rather its occupants. 3 figures stood before him, each representing a different facet of Commorrag's malevolent hierarchy, each studying him with the intense fascination of collectors who had just acquired the rarest specimen for their gallery. Homunculus Zerath dominated the space through sheer presence, his modified form a testament to millennia spent reshaping flesh according to whims that no sane mind should entertain. Where once he might have possessed the ethereal beauty common to his race, now only purposeful horror remained. Additional arms had been grafted to his torso, each ending in a different surgical implement, while his original hands had been replaced with mechanical appendages whose fingers could extend into microscalpels or inject compounds directly through the fingertips. His face was a masterwork of calculated terror, the features rearranged to optimize the psychological impact of his appearance while preserving the intelligence that blazed in eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. "Magnificent," Zerath murmured, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vocal cords modified for maximum effect. 800 years of perfect conditioning, genetic modifications that represent the pinnacle of human enhancement, and a will that has been forged in the crucible of absolute loyalty. You are, dear custodian, a puzzle worthy of my full attention. To Zerath's left stood a figure whose beauty was as perfect as the homunculus's form was twisted. Archon Vexthul of the Cabal of the Severed Chain wore his aristocratic heritage like a cloak, every line of his pale features speaking to bloodlines that stretched back to the height of the Eldar Empire. His armor was a work of art in its own right, each plate engraved with scenes of conquest and dominion, rendered in precious metals that caught and reflected the chamber's sickly light. Yet it was his eyes that marked him as truly dangerous, ancient beyond mortal reckoning, filled with the patient cunning of a predator who had survived the deadly politics of Comora for over 3 millennia. The first custodian ever taken alive, Vexthul said, his cultured tones carrying the weight of absolute authority. The Emperor's own chosen, delivered into our hands by fortune and careful planning. Tell me, Golden Warrior, do you comprehend the magnitude of what has occurred? Do you understand that your capture represents a victory beyond measure for the children of the Dark City? The third figure moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, each step calculated for maximum visual impact. Succubus Nithara of the Cult of the Laughing Wound was beauty weaponized, her form enhanced, not through the crude modifications favored by the homunculi, but through genetic perfection, refined over centuries of selective breeding and alchemical treatment. Her armor was minimal, designed to showcase rather than protect, while the weapons at her belt spoke to a mastery of combat that had been earned in 10,000 arena duels. She studied Valerian with the appreciation of an artist contemplating a particularly challenging canvas. "Look at him," Nithara purred, her voice carrying undertones that could drive lesser minds to distraction. Even suspended and helpless, he radiates defiance. Such spirit, such magnificent resistance. Breaking him will be the greatest pleasure Comorak has known in centuries. Valerian tested his bonds again, feeling the alien alloys respond to his movements with microscopic adjustments that maintained perfect tension regardless of his position. The restraints were works of art in their own right, designed not merely to hold, but to constantly remind the captive of their helplessness. Every struggle sent feedback through the system, each attempt at escape becoming part of the torment itself. "You waste your time," Valerian said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite the exotic acoustics. "I am a custodian of the Emperor. My will is not my own to surrender, nor do I possess information that would be of value to the enemies of mankind." The 3 Drukhari exchanged glances that spoke to communications beyond mere words. In the space of heartbeats, alliances were formed and territories divided, each of the Dark City's representatives claiming their portion of this unprecedented prize. Yet beneath the veneer of cooperation, Valerian could sense the tension that existed between them, the fundamental distrust that characterized all relationships in a realm where betrayal was not merely common, but expected. Zerath stepped forward, his mechanical fingers extending to trace patterns in the air inches from Valerian's face. "Information? Oh, my dear subject, you misunderstand entirely. We do not seek your knowledge of imperial battle plans or the location of strategic assets. Such things are ephemeral, useful for perhaps a decade or 2 before they become obsolete. What we seek is far more valuable. We seek to understand what makes you unbreakable," Vexthul continued, his pale hands clasped behind his back as he began to pace around Valerian's suspended form. "For 3,000 years I have broken the strongest wills, shattered the most defiant spirits, reduced heroes to gibbering wrecks who would sell their own mothers for a moment's respite from pain. Yet always there are rumors, whispers of warriors who cannot be turned, cannot be corrupted, cannot be made to yield. Nithara laughed, the sound like silver bells chiming in a charnel house. The ultimate challenge, the perfect hunt. To take one who believes himself above fear and teach him the true meaning of despair. To show the Emperor's chosen that even their golden perfection has limits. Valerian's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. Then you will be disappointed. I have sworn oaths that bind me more surely than any chains you might devise. My loyalty is not to myself, not to comfort, not even to life itself. It is to the master of mankind, and that loyalty cannot be severed by any torment you can imagine. The silence that followed was broken by Zerath's mechanical laughter, a sound like grinding metal and whistling steam. Imagine? My dear custodian, imagination is such a limited tool. Reality, however, offers so many more possibilities. The homunculus activated a control with one of his additional hands, and the chamber's lighting shifted to reveal the full scope of his domain. Tanks filled with writhing shapes that had once been sentient beings lined the walls, their contents suspended in fluids that kept them conscious while denying them the mercy of death. Surgical tables bore the remains of experiments in pain and modification, while mechanical devices of unknowable purpose hummed with barely restrained energy. "This is my laboratory," Zerath said with evident pride. "Here I have perfected techniques that would make the Inquisition's most skilled interrogators weep with envy. Pain amplifiers that can make the sensation of a gentle touch feel like molten metal poured across raw nerve endings. Psychological parasites that feed on specific memories while leaving the host conscious of their loss. Chemical compounds that can induce any emotional state I desire while preserving perfect awareness of the artificial nature of the experience." Vexathul moved to stand directly before Valerian, his ancient eyes meeting the custodian's gaze with absolute confidence. Yet Zerath's methods, masterful though they are, represent only one approach to our shared goal. I prefer subtlety, the careful application of precisely calculated pressure to achieve maximum effect. Show a warrior the futility of his cause, demonstrate the meaninglessness of his sacrifice, prove to him that his gods and masters care nothing for his suffering, and the will breaks more thoroughly than any amount of physical torment could achieve. The Archon gestured, and holographic displays flickered to life around the chamber, showing scenes from across the galaxy, imperial worlds burning under alien assault, space marine chapters falling to corruption, the endless grind of war that consumed millions of lives, daily in service to an emperor who sat silent and unmoving upon a throne of gold. "Look upon your Imperium, custodian," Vexthul whispered. "See the truth of what you serve. A rotting body of an empire ruled by a dead god, sustained only by the suffering of trillions who live and die without ever knowing freedom or joy. You call your bondage loyalty, but what loyalty is owed to a master who demands such sacrifice for so little return?" Nithara moved with predatory grace to complete the triangle around Valerian's suspended form. "And when my brothers have finished with their elaborate methodologies, when they have exhausted their techniques and proven the limitations of their approaches, then the true test begins. Pain can be endured, philosophy can be rejected, but in the arena, when death comes calling with blade in hand, the soul reveals its truest nature. I have seen the mightiest warriors reduced to cowardice when faced with the possibility of genuine defeat." She drew one of her weapons, a curved blade whose edge seemed to drink the light from the chamber. I will pit you against opponents, chosen specifically to exploit every weakness, every vulnerability. You will face creatures whose very existence is anathema to your training, challenges that cannot be overcome through strength or skill alone. And in those moments of perfect despair, when death reaches out to claim you, we will see what remains of the custodian's famous resolve. The three Drukhari stood in silence for a moment, each contemplating the unique pleasure their particular methodology would provide. Yet beneath their unity of purpose, Valerian could sense the competition that drove them, the need each felt to claim ultimate credit for breaking the unbreakable. It was a weakness, he realized, one that might prove useful in the trials to come. You think yourselves clever, Valerian said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 8 centuries of absolute certainty. You believe that suffering can be measured, categorized, optimized according to your twisted sciences. But you understand nothing of true strength, nothing of loyalty that transcends the self. I am not afraid of pain. I am not afraid of death. I am not afraid of any torment you can devise. He met each of their gazes in turn, his aquiline features set in an expression of absolute determination. I am Valerian Aurelius, shield captain of the Adeptus Custodes, guardian of the Golden Throne, servant of the Master of mankind, and I will not break. The challenge hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, transforming the chamber from laboratory to arena in the space of a heartbeat. The real test was about to begin. Chapter 4. The First Threshold. The first session began at what passed for dawn in the eternal twilight of Comera, though in this realm of perpetual shadow, time moved according to the whims of those who ruled rather than any natural law. Zerath approached his captive with the measured steps of a master craftsman preparing to work with the finest materials, his mechanical appendages clicking together in anticipation, while his original hands flexed with barely contained eagerness. "Pain," the homunculus began, his modified voice, carrying harmonic frequencies designed to induce unease, is perhaps the most honest form of communication. It cuts through pretense, strips away artifice, reduces the subject to their most fundamental essence. What we discover in the next few hours will tell us more about your true nature than 8 centuries of service records ever could. Valerian watched with the clinical detachment of a warrior who had faced death countless times before, as Zerath activated a series of devices arrayed around his suspended form. Bio-neural interfacing cables extended from hidden recesses in the chamber walls, their tips gleaming with microscopic injection systems designed to bypass even enhanced immune responses. Pain amplifiers hummed to life, their crystalline structures pulsing with energies that could magnify nerve responses 1,000-fold. The first injection came without warning, a cocktail of compounds that had been refined over millennia to induce specific neurological responses. Valerian felt his enhanced metabolism attempt to purge the foreign substances, but Zerath had prepared for such resistance. Secondary compounds bound to the custodian's genetic modifications themselves, using his superhuman physiology against him by amplifying the very systems that normally provided protection. Pain bloomed through his nervous system like fire through dry tinder, each nerve ending suddenly blazing with sensations that transcended anything his training had prepared him to endure. The agony was not random, but carefully orchestrated, designed to overwhelm specific cognitive functions while leaving others intact. Zerath wanted him conscious and aware, fully capable of experiencing every nuance of what was being done to him. Yet Valerian's response was not what the homunculus expected. Rather than crying out or struggling against his bonds, the custodian began to recite the canticle of absolute duty, his voice steady despite the chemical fire burning through his veins. Each word was pronounced with perfect clarity, each syllable an act of defiance against the alien torments being inflicted upon him. "Interesting," Zerath murmured, his ancient eyes studying readouts that displayed Valerian's neurological responses in real time. "The pain receptors are fully engaged. The neural pathways are being overwhelmed exactly as the compounds were designed to achieve, yet the psychological response remains completely unchanged. Fascinating." Hours passed in this fashion, with Zerath introducing new variables to his equation of agony, while Valerian maintained his mental discipline through techniques that had been passed down through generations of custodian guard, the litanies of loyalty, the meditative practices that allowed a warrior to separate mind from body, the absolute certainty of purpose that transformed suffering from defeat into simply another challenge to be overcome. As the physical torment proved inadequate, Zerath's frustration began to manifest in increasingly desperate measures. Biomodification tools designed to reshape flesh were brought into play, their crystalline edges slicing through enhanced skin and muscle with surgical precision. Yet each wound was inflicted not to maim, but to create new pathways for pain, fresh nerve clusters that could be stimulated in ways that baseline human anatomy could never support. "Your body betrays you," Zerath whispered as he worked, his mechanical fingers extending microscopic filaments into the wounds to interface directly with Valerian's nervous system. "Every enhancement your Emperor granted you, every modification that elevates you above mortal humanity, becomes another avenue for my art. You are more sensitive to pain, not less. Your awareness is heightened, not dimmed. You feel everything I do to you, with an intensity that would drive a normal human mind to immediate madness." Still Valerian endured, his aquiline features set in an expression of absolute determination. When the homunculus paused to check his instruments, the custodian spoke for the first time in hours, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite the ongoing torments. "Is this the extent of your skill? I have endured the psychic screams of demons, felt my flesh burned away by the weapons of traitor legions, stood in the presence of the Emperor's own divine radiance. Your crude manipulations are merely another form of training." The words struck Zerath with more force than any weapon could have delivered. In 3 millennia of practicing his art, no subject had ever dismissed his techniques as mere training. The homunculus stepped back from his instruments, mechanical appendages trembling with barely controlled rage before activating a communication system that connected to other parts of his domain. "Vexthul," he called, his voice tight with frustration. "Perhaps your methods will prove more effective than mine." The Archon arrived within moments, his pale features arranged in an expression of aristocratic amusement as he observed the scene before him. Zerath had been working for the better part of a standard day, yet their captive appeared no closer to breaking than when the session had begun. If anything, Valerian seemed more focused, more centered in his resolve. "Pain of the flesh is transitory," Vexthul said, as he dismissed the biomodification equipment with a gesture. "It is the pain of the spirit that truly breaks a subject, the agony of understanding one's own meaninglessness in the face of universal indifference." The chamber's atmosphere shifted as psychic projectors came online, their alien architecture channeling energies that existed at the intersection of technology and sorcery. Holographic displays flickered to life around Valerian's suspended form, showing scenes from across the galaxy, rendered with perfect clarity and devastating psychological precision. Terror itself appeared first, the throne world of humanity revealed in all its grim majesty. But this was not the golden paradise of imperial propaganda. This was reality, The endless sprawl of hive cities where billions lived and died in squalor, the towering spires of the nobility built upon foundations of human misery, the vast industrial complexes that consumed lives as readily as raw materials. The emperor himself was shown upon the golden throne, not as the divine master of mankind, but as a rotting body sustained by machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. "Look upon your master," Vexthul commanded, his voice carrying psychic resonance that made each word seem to echo from inside Valerian's own mind. "See the truth of what you serve. A dead god who demands worship he cannot acknowledge, sustained by suffering he cannot prevent, ruling an empire he cannot protect." The images shifted, showing imperial worlds falling to alien invasion, while Space Marine chapters remained committed to other battles, showing loyal servants of the Imperium condemned for crimes they had not committed, showing the endless bureaucracy that consumed resources while citizens starved. Each scene was carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact, designed to demonstrate the futility of loyalty to a system that cared nothing for individual sacrifice. Yet Valerian's response was not despair, but something that took the Archon entirely by surprise. The custodian began to smile, an expression of such genuine warmth and certainty that it seemed to radiate light in the chamber's eternal gloom. "You show me the burden," Valerian said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 8 centuries of absolute conviction. "But you cannot see the purpose? Yes, the Imperium is flawed. Yes, mankind suffers under the weight of 10,000 years of constant war. Yet without the Emperor's guidance, without the structure of the Imperium, humanity would have been consumed by chaos long ago. Every life that suffers still lives. Every world that endures still hopes. The alternative is not freedom, but extinction." Vexthul's composure cracked for the first time, his aristocratic features twisting with genuine confusion. The psychological profiles he had developed over millennia suggested that confronting subjects with the reality of their situation inevitably led to despair and eventual capitulation. Yet this custodian seemed to draw strength from acknowledging the very suffering that should have broken him. "You are either a fool or a madman," the Archon whispered. "I am neither," Valerian replied. "I am a guardian, and guardians do not abandon their posts because the duty is difficult." The failure of psychological warfare left Vexthul as frustrated as Zerath had been, though the Archon concealed his emotions behind a mask of aristocratic indifference. It was Nithara who stepped forward next, her perfect features arranged in an expression of predatory anticipation as she studied the suspended custodian. "My brothers seek to break you through complexity," the succubus said, her voice carrying undertones that spoke to the most primitive parts of consciousness. "But truth is simple. Pain can be endured, philosophy can be rejected, but death cannot be denied. Face me in combat, custodian. Let us see if your vaunted skill can overcome the weakness of your current state." The restraints released with a crystalline chime, dropping Valerian to the chamber floor with barely enough warning to land on his feet. His enhanced reflexes, still functioning despite hours of torment, allowed him to maintain balance as circulation returned to limbs that had been suspended for far too long. A weapon was thrown at his feet, not his guardian spear, but a crude iron blade that would have been primitive in the age of Terra's ancient kingdoms. Nithara drew her own weapons, curved blades whose edges seemed to drink light from the surrounding air, while their hilts pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Behind her, 3 of her most skilled witches emerged from concealment, each a master of combat who had earned their position through countless arena victories. The fight that followed was a masterclass in tactical awareness, despite overwhelming disadvantage. Valerian's body bore the effects of hours of torment, his enhanced physiology struggling to purge chemical compounds that had been specifically designed to resist his immunity systems. His weapon was inferior, his opponents were fresh and equipped with superior gear, and the chamber's layout favored their mobility over his defensive capabilities. Yet the custodian fought with a skill that transcended mere technique, each movement flowing from 8 centuries of experience in warfare against every conceivable enemy. He used the chamber's architecture against his opponents, channeling their attacks into positions where numbers became disadvantage rather than asset. His crude blade found gaps in armor that should have been impossible to exploit, while his enhanced awareness allowed him to anticipate strikes before they were fully committed, the first which fell when Valerian used her own momentum against her, redirecting an ending blow into her companion, while his return stroke opened her throat to the bone. The second lasted longer, her superior weapons and fresh condition offsetting his experience, until a feint left her overextended and vulnerable to a thrust that pierced her heart. The third managed to wound him, her blade carving a deep furrow across his ribs before his counterattack shattered her spine. Nithara herself proved the greatest challenge, her movements fluid as water and deadly as poisoned steel. The combat became a dance of death that ranged across the entire chamber, each warrior testing the limits of the other's skill. Yet despite her advantages, despite his wounds and weakness, Valerian slowly gained the upper hand through sheer determination and tactical superiority. The end came when the succubus attempted a finishing move that left her momentarily vulnerable, a technique that had served her well in 10,000 arena battles, but had never been tested against a warrior of Valerian's caliber. His crude blade found the gap between her armor plates, sliding through enhanced flesh to pierce the dual hearts that sustained her unnatural life. Silence fell over the chamber as Nithara collapsed, her perfect features frozen in an expression of disbelief. The 3 Drukhari who had sought to break the unbreakable stood among the bodies of their finest warriors, forced to confront the reality that their first attempts had not merely failed, but had been utterly defeated. Valerian stood swaying among the carnage, his primitive weapon dripping with alien blood, while his own wounds painted crimson streaks across his scarred flesh. Yet his voice was steady when he spoke, carrying the same absolute certainty that had marked his every word since awakening in this place of torment. "I told you," he said quietly. "I will not break." The real test was only beginning. Chapter 5. Echoes of Loyalty. The aftermath of combat brought no respite, only the cold efficiency of Drukhari medical technology as Zerath's servo skulls tended to Valerian's wounds with surgical precision. The homunculus wanted his subject alive and functional for what was to come, though the gleam in his ancient eyes spoke of frustrations that had been building since the torment sessions began. Each failure to break the custodian only strengthened his obsession with understanding what made such resistance possible. As bioregenerative compounds sealed the furrows left by witch blades, Valerian retreated into the mental disciplines that had sustained him through 8 centuries of warfare. The pain became distant, relegated to background awareness, while his consciousness turned inward to the memories that defined him. In the depths of his mind, he could still hear the voice that had shaped his existence, the words that had transformed him from mere human into something infinitely more. Terror, 800 years past. The endless laboratories beneath the imperial palace where the emperor's greatest work proceeded in absolute secrecy. He had been selected as a child, chosen from among the billions of Terra's population for genetic compatibility that occurred perhaps once in every 10 million births. The process of becoming a custodian was not the mass production that created Space Marines, but rather the individual crafting of a unique masterpiece. Each candidate was personally overseen by the Emperor himself, every modification tailored to maximize the potential that lay dormant within human DNA. The memories came unbidden now, summoned by necessity rather than nostalgia. Valerian recalled the endless cycles of genetic therapy and psycho-conditioning, the gradual transformation of his body and mind until he stood as living proof of humanity's potential. Yet it was not the physical changes that mattered most. It was the moment when the master of mankind had placed a hand upon his shoulder and spoken the words that would define his existence for all eternity. "You are my will made manifest," the Emperor had said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through both flesh and spirit. "Where I cannot walk, you shall stand vigil. What I cannot protect, you shall guard with your life. You are not merely a warrior, child. You are hope given form, the living promise that mankind's future shall endure regardless of what darkness rises to challenge it." The sacred oath had followed, words that transcended mere language to become fundamental aspects of his being. He had sworn not merely loyalty, but absolute dedication, promising service that would continue beyond death itself if such were required. The ceremony had taken place in the presence of the Golden Throne, in that hallowed chamber where the Emperor's psychic might blazed like a second sun, and every word had been burned into his soul with the intensity of stellar fire. Present reality intruded as Zerath activated new instruments, devices whose purpose became clear as they interfaced with the neural pathways still raw from the bioregeneration process. "Memories," the homunculus whispered, his mechanical appendages extending microscopic filaments toward Valerian's skull. "The foundation upon which personality is built, the bedrock of identity itself. I have developed techniques that can edit specific recollections, replacing cherished moments with fabricated horrors that feel more real than actual experience." The psychic parasites were his masterwork, semi-sentient constructs that could invade memory centers and begin systematic corruption of everything that made an individual who they were. They would find the moments of greatest emotional significance and twist them into sources of despair rather than strength. A beloved mentor would become a tyrant. A moment of triumph would transform into humiliating defeat. The very foundations of self would crumble as false memories overwrote the authentic experiences that defined identity. Yet as the parasites attempted to penetrate Valerian's mental defenses, they encountered something unprecedented. The custodian's memories were not merely personal recollections, but sacred bonds that connected him directly to the Emperor's will. Each attempt to corrupt them triggered psychological defenses that had been crafted by the most powerful psychic entity in human history. The parasites recoiled as if burned, their alien consciousness overwhelmed by contact with memories that blazed with divine authority. "Impossible," Zerath breathed, his instruments showing readings that defied every precedent his millennia of experience had established. The memories resist alteration, as if they were fundamental constants rather than mere neural patterns. Valerian's voice carried clearly through the chamber as he recited portions of the custodian's creed, each word radiating absolute conviction despite the ongoing assault upon his mind. "My memory is sacred, for it holds the Emperor's trust. My thoughts are pure, for they serve only his will. My loyalty is absolute, for it was forged in the fires of his presence." The failure of memory manipulation marked a turning point in the dynamic between captor and prisoner. Zerath stepped back from his instruments, mechanical appendages trembling with barely controlled rage, while the readings continued to show the impossible reality that his finest techniques had been utterly defeated. Yet it was Vexthul who moved to fill the void left by the homunculus's retreat, his aristocratic features arranged in an expression of cold calculation. "If the mind cannot be reached through memory," the Archon said quietly, "then perhaps it can be accessed through conscience." The chamber's entrance iris dilated to admit a procession that struck Valerian with more force than any torment device could have delivered. Imperial citizens, survivors of the Xerian Prime devastation, were herded into the space by Kabbalite warriors whose splinter rifles remained trained on their terrified charges. Men, women, children, the innocent whose rescue had motivated the original mission that led to his capture. They bore the marks of Drukhari hospitality, scars and modifications that spoke to the creative cruelty of their captors. Yet they lived. More importantly, they recognized him. Despite his wounds, despite the circumstances, they saw the golden armor and knew him for what he represented. Hope flickered in eyes that had been dead with despair only moments before. 17 survivors, Vexthul announced with aristocratic precision. All that remains of Xerian Prime's 17 million souls. Their continued existence depends entirely upon your cooperation, Custodian. Break, and they live. Maintain your defiance, and they die one by one while you watch. The moral calculus was elegantly simple and utterly devastating. Valerian's duty was to the Emperor and the Imperium as a whole, obligations that transcended any individual lives regardless of their innocence. Yet these people had suffered because of choices he had made, had endured torments beyond imagination because his rescue mission had failed. Their blood was on his hands, as surely as if he had brought them down himself. "You see the dilemma," Vexthul continued, his pale hands clasped behind his back as he began to pace before the suspended prisoners. "Duty demands that you maintain your resistance, that you preserve the secrets and capabilities that make you valuable to the Imperial war machine. Yet conscience demands that you spare these innocents further suffering. Which voice will you choose to obey?" Before Valerian could respond, Nithara stepped forward with predatory grace, her perfect features arranged in an expression of eager anticipation. The wounds she had suffered in their previous combat had been healed through Drukhari biotechnology, leaving her as deadly as ever, while adding new scars that only enhanced her terrible beauty. "Or perhaps," she purred, "we might make this interesting. A wager, Custodian. Face me in single combat one more time. If you win, these pitiful creatures go free, returned to Imperial space with enough supplies to reach safety. If you lose..." She let the implications hang unspoken in the chamber's fetid air. The challenge was another trap, of course. Valerian's body still bore the effects of hours of torment, while Nithara was fresh and equipped with weapons specifically designed to exploit any weakness. Yet the offer contained a flicker of genuine hope, the possibility that skill and determination might triumph over impossible odds. It was exactly the sort of heroic gesture that the Custodian's conditioning compelled him to attempt. "I accept," Valerian said without hesitation, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that had marked every decision throughout his service. "Release my bonds." The combat that followed was a masterpiece of tactical warfare, compressed into the span of minutes. Nithara fought with the fluid grace of a dancer, combined with the lethality of a predator, her twin blades weaving patterns of death that would have overwhelmed any lesser opponent. Yet Valerian met every strike with perfectly calculated counters, his enhanced reflexes, and 8 centuries of experience allowing him to anticipate attacks before they were fully committed. The succubus had learned from their previous encounter, adapting her techniques to account for his superior tactical awareness while pressing advantages in equipment and physical condition. Her blades carried toxins that could paralyze even enhanced immune systems, while her armor incorporated reactive defenses that turned near misses into opportunities for counterattack. Yet the custodian fought with something beyond mere skill. He fought with the desperate fury of a guardian who refused to see innocents suffer while he possessed the power to intervene. Each strike carried the weight of his oath. Each parry reflected 8 centuries of absolute dedication to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The end came when Nithara attempted the same finishing technique that had nearly succeeded in their first encounter, a complex sequence of feints and strikes designed to overwhelm even superhuman reflexes. But Valerian had been analyzing her patterns throughout their battle, cataloguing every preference and tendency until he could predict her actions with mathematical precision. His borrowed blade found the gap between armor plates at exactly the moment when her own attack left her most vulnerable. The crude iron pierced her primary heart with surgical accuracy, sending her collapsing to the chamber floor in a spreading pool of alien blood. Silence fell as the succubus breathed her last, her perfect features frozen in an expression of disbelief that mirrored her earlier defeat. Valerian stood swaying among the carnage once again, his wounds reopened by the exertion, while exhaustion threatened to claim his consciousness. Yet his voice remained steady as he addressed the surviving Drukhari. "The terms are satisfied. Release them." Vexthal's laughter filled the chamber like the tolling of funeral bells, aristocratic amusement warped by millennia of corruption until it became something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of the damned. Oh, my naive custodian, did you truly believe that any promise made in this place carried binding force? The agreement was with Nithara, and she is dead. Her debts died with her. The Archon gestured, and the Kabbalite warriors opened fire on the helpless prisoners. Splinter rounds tore through unprotected flesh, while the screams of the dying echoed through the chamber's twisted acoustics. Men who had survived the fall of their world fell in pools of their own blood. Women who had endured unspeakable torments found release only in death. Children whose only crime had been existing in the path of Drukhari raiders were cut down without mercy or remorse. Valerian watched it all with eyes that blazed like twin stars, his aquiline features set in an expression that transcended rage to become something far more dangerous. The deaths of innocents burned themselves into his memory with the same intensity as his most sacred oaths. But rather than breaking his spirit, they forged it into something harder than adamantium. When the defeat was complete and silence returned to the chamber, the custodian spoke with a voice that carried harmonics of absolute judgment. "You have made an error, Archon. You believe that witnessing suffering will weaken my resolve. Instead, you have shown me exactly what happens when evil is allowed to flourish unchecked." His gaze fell upon each of the surviving Drukhari in turn, and they saw something in those golden eyes that made them step back despite themselves. This was no longer merely a prisoner to be broken through careful application of pain and psychological pressure. This was a force of nature that had been given focus and direction by their own cruelty. "I will escape this place," Valerian continued, his words carrying the weight of prophecy rather than mere intention. "And when I do, I will ensure that each of you answers for what you have done. Not merely to me, but to every innocent soul whose suffering has fed your unnatural existence." The cold fury in his voice promised retribution that would span lifetimes if necessary. The hunt was about to become something entirely different. Chapter 6. The Pain Engine's Song. The death of Nithara marked more than the loss of a single succubus. It represented the failure of an entire methodology that had served the Drukhari for millennia. As her body was dragged away by silent slave constructs, Zerath stood before his instruments, with mechanical appendages trembling in barely controlled obsession. The homunculus had devoted 3,000 years to perfecting the science of suffering, yet this single custodian had proven immune to every technique in his arsenal. Fascinating, he whispered to himself, mechanical fingers clicking together as they sorted through data streams that displayed Valerian's physiological responses throughout the previous encounters. Traditional approaches assume baseline human psychology, but this specimen represents something entirely beyond normal parameters. The genetic modifications run deeper than mere physical enhancement. They have fundamentally altered the relationship between pain and consciousness. Vexthul watched the homunculus work with growing unease, his aristocratic features arranged in an expression of careful neutrality. The Archon had allied himself with Zerath because the flesh sculptor's reputation for breaking the unbreakable was legendary throughout Komarach. Yet as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that obsession was replacing methodology in the homunculus's approach to their captive. Perhaps, Vexthul suggested with diplomatic delicacy, we should consider alternative approaches. The specimen has proven remarkably resilient, but surely there are limits to what even enhanced physiology can endure. Zerath's response was a laugh that combined organic vocal cords with mechanical harmonics in ways that violated several natural laws. Limits? My dear Archon, you still think in terms of conventional torment. This requires something entirely new, a device specifically calibrated for custodian biology. Behold my masterwork. The chamber's floor began to shift as hidden mechanisms activated, mechanical systems that had been integrated into the very architecture of the laboratory, revealing themselves for the first time. What rose from the depths was a construction that defied categorization, part surgical instrument and part work of twisted art, its crystalline components pulsing with energies that seemed to exist at the intersection of pain and mathematics. The pain engine was unlike any device Zerath had created before, where his previous instruments worked within the limitations of existing nervous systems. This machine was designed to create entirely new pathways for suffering. Crystalline probes extended from its central hub, like the arms of some impossible spider, each one calibrated to interface with specific aspects of custodian enhancement. Bioneural connectors that could tap directly into enhanced reflexes, psychic resonators that would amplify conscious awareness while preventing the merciful escape of unconsciousness, chemical injectors loaded with compounds synthesized from his analysis of Valerian's unique physiology. You see, Zerath explained as he made final adjustments to the device, conventional torment assumes that suffering serves as a deterrent to unwanted behavior. But what if the subject's conditioning has removed that limitation? What if pain has been transformed from obstacle into merely another form of data to be processed and overcome? The homunculus gestured, and servo-skulls began repositioning Valerian's restraints, aligning his suspended form with precision guides that would allow the pain engine optimal access to every major nerve cluster. The custodian watched the preparations with the clinical detachment of a warrior who had accepted the inevitability of death, yet something in his golden eyes suggested that acceptance was not the same as surrender. Then we must create entirely new categories of experience, Zerath continued, his voice rising with the fervor of a true believer, describing religious revelation. Pain that exists beyond the normal spectrum of human endurance, sensations that have no evolutionary analogue, no survival purpose, no meaning beyond the pure expression of controlled agony. The machine activated with a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through the chamber's bone walls, its crystalline components blazing with energies that made the air itself recoil in apparent distress. The first probes extended toward Valerian's form with surgical precision, their tips penetrating enhanced skin to interface directly with nerve clusters that had been modified to handle superhuman levels of stimulus and response. What followed was a symphony of suffering, orchestrated with scientific precision. Each probe delivered carefully calibrated sensations, designed to overwhelm specific aspects of custodian conditioning, neural feedback that turned enhanced reflexes into sources of constant agony, psychic resonance that amplified conscious awareness while preventing the mind's natural defenses from engaging, chemical compounds that induced phantom pain in organs that had been genetically modified beyond baseline human norms. Yet even as the pain engine worked its malevolent artistry, something unexpected began to manifest in the data streams that monitored Valerian's responses. Where Zerath had expected gradual deterioration of mental function, instead he found evidence of adaptation. The custodian's enhanced physiology was not merely enduring the torment, but actively analyzing it, cataloging each sensation and response with the same methodical precision that characterized his approach to warfare. Hours passed in this fashion, with the pain engine cycling through increasingly exotic combinations, while Zerath monitored results that defied every precedent his millennia of experience had established. The custodian's body showed clear evidence of the machine's work: tremors that spoke to nervous system overload, involuntary muscle contractions that indicated pain beyond mortal endurance, physiological responses that should have resulted in immediate psychological collapse. Yet Valerian's mind remained intact, protected by conditioning that transcended mere training to become something approaching divine intervention. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the chamber, despite the ongoing torment, each word pronounced with perfect clarity and absolute conviction. "Is this the extent of your understanding?" he asked, his golden eyes meeting Zerath's mechanical gaze with unwavering directness. "You believe that consciousness can be reduced to mere neurological function? That identity exists only in the firing patterns of synapses and the chemical cascades of emotion. Yet you comprehend nothing of true strength." The words struck the homunculus with more force than any physical weapon could have delivered. Throughout his existence, Zerath had defined himself through his mastery of flesh and spirit, his ability to reduce any subject to their component elements of fear and despair. That this custodian could not merely endure, but actively dismiss his finest work, represented a challenge to everything he believed about the nature of consciousness itself. "Enlighten me," Zerath whispered, his mechanical appendages adjusting the pain engine's settings to even more extreme parameters. "Tell me what strength truly means when stripped of flesh and reduced to pure experience." Valerian's response came not as explanation, but as demonstration. Despite the ongoing torment, despite the machine's systematic assault upon every enhanced sense and genetically modified nerve cluster, he began to recite passages from the custodian's creed with perfect pronunciation and flawless timing. Each word was an act of defiance, proof that no amount of physical suffering could touch the core of what made him who he was. The recitation continued for hours, with Valerian's voice never wavering, despite torments that should have driven him to madness within minutes. Zerath increased the machine's output beyond safety parameters, pushing the pain engine to levels that began to cause structural damage to the device itself. Still, the custodian endured, his words becoming a counter-melody to the machine's harmonic resonance, until the chamber filled with the impossible sound of human will triumphing over alien technology. It was during the 7th hour of continuous torment that political reality intruded upon the laboratory's isolation. Vexthul received a communication through channels that bypassed normal Cabal hierarchies, messages that spoke to interest from quarters of Comora, whose attention no rational being should wish to attract. "Zerath," the Archon said quietly, his aristocratic composure showing cracks for the first time since the sessions began. "We have a problem. Word of our prize has reached the Supreme Overlords. They are curious about our progress." The homunculus barely acknowledged the warning, his attention focused entirely on data streams that showed the impossible reality of a subject who grew stronger rather than weaker under extreme torment. Yet Vexthul's next words penetrated even his obsession with scientific methodology. "Asdrubal Vecht himself has expressed interest in observing our methods." The mention of Comora's supreme ruler sent chills through even Zerath's modified nervous system. Vecht was ancient beyond mortal comprehension, a being who had survived every political upheaval and dynastic shift that had shaped the Dark City's history. His interest in any subject invariably led to that subject's acquisition by the Supreme Overlords, regardless of prior claims or territorial boundaries. "How long?" Zerath asked, his mechanical appendages continuing to adjust the pain engine, even as he contemplated the implications of high-level attention. "Perhaps a day. Perhaps less. The Supreme Overlords do not announce their movements to lesser beings." Vexthul's voice carried undertones of barely controlled panic. "If we cannot demonstrate significant progress before their arrival, they will simply take the specimen and leave us to explain our failures to empty air." Yet even as political pressures mounted around him, Zerath found his attention drawn inexorably back to the impossible data his instruments continued to generate. The custodian was not merely enduring torment, but somehow transforming it into something else entirely. Pain became meditation. Suffering became strength. Each assault upon his consciousness only served to clarify his purpose and strengthen his resolve. "You begin to understand," Valerian said, his voice cutting through both the pain engine's harmonics and the mounting tension between his captors. "You measure strength in terms of what can be broken, but true power lies in what cannot be bent. You seek to find my limits, but you cannot comprehend that some things exist beyond the reach of limitation." The custodian's gaze shifted between the two surviving Drukhari, and for the first time since his capture, they saw something in those golden eyes that made them step back despite themselves. This was no longer merely a prisoner enduring torment through superior conditioning. This was a force of nature that had been given focus and purpose by their own cruelty. "Tell me, homunculus," Valerian continued, his words carrying implications that transcended mere conversation. "In all your centuries of perfecting the art of suffering, have you ever considered what happens when pain is embraced rather than endured? When agony becomes not obstacle but enlightenment?" The questions hung in the chamber's fetid air like blades poised to fall. For the first time in millennia, Zerath found himself confronted with a subject who was not merely resisting his techniques, but actively turning them into sources of strength. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and the hunt itself was being redefined according to rules that no Drukhari mind could fully comprehend. The real test was only beginning. Chapter 7. The Turning of the Screw. The silence that followed Valerian's philosophical challenge stretched through the chamber like a blade drawn across raw nerves. For the first time since his capture, the custodian had shifted from defensive endurance to active engagement, transforming the dynamic from torturer and victim into something far more complex. Zerath stood frozen before his instruments, mechanical appendages trembling as his ancient mind processed implications that threatened the fundamental assumptions of his existence. Yet it was this moment of Drukhari uncertainty that Valerian seized upon with the tactical precision that had served him through 8 centuries of warfare. His golden eyes, still blazing with undiminished determination despite hours of systematic torment, focused upon each of his captors with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the fears and insecurities that lay beneath their carefully constructed masks. "Tell me, homunculus," Valerian said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone conducting a clinical analysis, "in all your millennia of perfecting the art of suffering, have you ever wondered what drives your obsession? What compels you to pursue knowledge that serves no purpose beyond the satisfaction of curiosity that borders on the pathological?" Zerath's response was immediate and visceral, mechanical appendages extending toward the pain engine's controls, as if physical torment could silence questions that cut too close to uncomfortable truths. Yet before he could activate the device, Valerian continued speaking with the relentless logic of someone who had spent the previous hours studying his captors as intently as they had studied him. "You claim to seek understanding of what makes the unbreakable, yet you cannot see the obsession that drives your every action. Each failure to break my will only strengthens your compulsion to try again, regardless of practical considerations or strategic objectives. You are no longer the master of your art, Zerath. You have become its slave." The words struck with surgical precision at the deepest vulnerabilities in the homunculus's psyche. Throughout his existence, Zerath had defined himself as the ultimate practitioner of controlled cruelty, a being who shaped pain according to his will rather than being shaped by it. The suggestion that his pursuit of knowledge had become an addiction rather than a choice challenged the very foundation of his identity. "Fascinating psychological assessment," Zerath replied, his modified voice carrying harmonics that betrayed the emotional impact of Valerian's analysis, despite his attempt at clinical detachment. "Yet you fail to understand that scientific methodology requires persistence in the face of unexpected variables." Valerian's laugh was soft, but carried undertones that made both surviving Drukhari step back, despite themselves. It was the sound of someone who had seen through carefully constructed facades to the truth that lay beneath, and found that truth lacking in every respect. "Scientific methodology," he repeated, his tone suggesting genuine amusement. "Is that what you call your inability to accept that some things exist beyond your comprehension? Look at yourself, creature. You have abandoned every other project in your laboratory to focus exclusively on breaking me. You work without rest, without pause, without consideration for anything beyond your own compulsive need to succeed where you have already failed." The custodian's gaze shifted to encompass the elaborate equipment that surrounded his suspended form, each device representing centuries of development and refinement in the service of inflicting suffering. Yet rather than showing fear or revulsion, his expression carried only analytical interest, as if he were studying weapons in an armory rather than instruments of torment. "Your subordinates whisper behind your back," Valerian continued, his voice carrying the certainty of someone stating observable fact rather than making accusations. "They see how this single failure has consumed you, how your reputation for methodical precision has given way to increasingly desperate attempts to salvage pride through brute force. How long before they begin to question whether the legendary Zerath has finally encountered a problem that exceeds his capabilities?" Each word was calculated for maximum psychological impact, delivered with the same precision that characterized the custodian's approach to physical combat. Valerian had spent the previous hours not merely enduring torment, but analyzing the political dynamics between his captors, identifying the stress points and vulnerabilities that could be exploited to turn their alliance against itself. Vex Thul, who had remained silent during this exchange, now stepped forward with the careful movements of someone who recognized the danger inherent in the situation, but was uncertain how to address it. The Archon's aristocratic features showed cracks in their usual mask of absolute composure, evidence that Valyrian's psychological warfare was achieving effects that no amount of physical torment had managed to accomplish. "Interesting tactics, Custodian," Vex Thul said, his cultured voice carrying undertones of genuine respect mixed with growing wariness. "Yet surely you must realize that turning our attention to internal dynamics serves only to delay the inevitable. Your resistance, however admirable, cannot continue indefinitely." Valyrian's response was to focus his analytical gaze upon the Archon with the same intensity he had directed toward Zerath, his expression suggesting that he had been waiting for exactly this opening. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, backed by centuries of experience in reading the psychological profiles of enemies and allies alike. "Cannot continue indefinitely," he repeated, his tone suggesting that he found the Archon's words deeply revealing. "Tell me, Vex Thul, is that assessment based on tactical analysis or personal need? Because from where I observe, your alliance with the homunculus serves purposes that extend far beyond mere curiosity about custodian conditioning." The accusation hung in the chamber's fetid air like a blade poised to fall, transforming what had been a statement of fact into a challenge that struck at the heart of Drukhari political dynamics. Vex Thul's pale features tightened imperceptibly, evidence that the custodian's words had found their mark, despite the Archon's attempts to maintain emotional distance. "You seek validation," Valyrian continued, his voice carrying the relentless logic of someone conducting a tactical debriefing rather than engaging in psychological warfare. 3,000 years of survival in Commorrag's political hierarchy, yet you still feel the need to prove your worth through association with the homunculus's reputation. What failure drives that insecurity, Archon? What humiliation from your past makes the approval of a flesh sculptor seem necessary for your self-worth? The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses, charged with tensions that spoke to fundamental cracks in the alliance between the two surviving Drukhari. Zerath's mechanical appendages had stopped their constant motion for the first time since the sessions began, while Vex Thul's carefully controlled breathing suggested emotional responses that went far beyond mere academic interest in torment techniques. Yet Valyrian was far from finished with his psychological assault. His enhanced senses, still functioning despite the systematic attempts to overwhelm them, detected subtle changes in body language and vocal patterns that revealed information about the power dynamics within this section of Commorragh. Each observation became another weapon in an arsenal of psychological warfare that drew upon 8 centuries of experience in reading enemies and exploiting their weaknesses. "The Supreme Overlords grow impatient," he stated with the certainty of someone who had been monitoring his captor's communications through careful observation rather than direct access. "Vect's interest represents both opportunity and threat, doesn't it? Success brings reward, but failure brings consequences that neither of you wishes to contemplate." The mention of external political pressures transformed the atmosphere within the chamber from tense collaboration to barely concealed paranoia. Both Drukhari began to regard their partner with the sideways glances and careful positioning that characterized beings who had suddenly remembered that alliance and betrayal were merely different faces of the same political coin. "Which of you," Valyrian asked with genuine curiosity, "plans to claim credit for breaking me when that moment finally arrives? Zerath, will you argue that your pain engine succeeded where conventional methods failed? Or perhaps Vexthul believes that his psychological insights provided the crucial breakthrough that made success possible. The questions struck at the heart of every partnership in Comora's history, exposing the fundamental selfishness that made genuine cooperation impossible among beings who had spent millennia perfecting the art of betrayal. Each Drukhari began to evaluate their partner not as ally, but as potential rival for the glory that would come from being the first to break a custodian's will. "And what happens?" Valerian continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic properties. "When one of you realizes that the other has become more liability than asset? How long before Zerath's obsession becomes embarrassing enough to warrant elimination? How many failures can Vexthul's reputation absorb before his political value transforms into political weakness?" The psychological assault reached its crescendo as Valerian planted the final seed of suspicion that would grow to consume whatever remained of their alliance. His voice carried the weight of prophecy as he delivered his most devastating observation about the nature of Drukhari society and the inevitable conclusion toward which their partnership was trending. "Perhaps," he suggested with the tone of someone conducting a purely theoretical analysis, "one of you has already concluded that keeping me intact serves personal interests better than achieving the original objective. After all, what greater source of power could exist in Comora than being the sole possessor of an unbroken custodian? The leverage such a prize would provide in political negotiations, the fear it would inspire in rivals, the prestige that would come from displaying the Emperor's chosen as a personal trophy." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of Comora's endless nocturnal activities filtering through the chamber's walls. Yet in that silence, Valerian could sense the shift in dynamic that marked his first genuine victory since awakening in this place of torment. The hunters had become hunted, turned against each other through careful application of psychological pressure that exploited their own nature against them. For the first time since his capture, the custodian allowed himself a smile that carried no warmth but infinite satisfaction. The real hunt was about to begin, and the prey would soon discover what it meant to face a predator who had spent 8 centuries learning to kill with words as efficiently as with weapons. The alliance was beginning to fracture, and in those fractures lay the seeds of his eventual liberation. Chapter 8. The Labyrinth Breaks. The fracture lines that Valerian had so carefully cultivated through psychological warfare finally reached their breaking point with an inevitability that seemed to shake the very foundations of Comorag itself. The moment came, not with grand declarations or formal challenges, but with the subtle shift in posture that marked the transition from uneasy alliance to open hostility among beings whose nature made betrayal as natural as breathing. Zerath was the first to act upon the paranoia that had been growing like a cancer within his modified consciousness. His mechanical appendages moved with sudden violence toward control systems that had nothing to do with the pain engine, activating defensive protocols that sealed the laboratory's primary entrance, while simultaneously flooding the chamber with pheromone compounds designed to induce aggression in any Drukhari exposed to their influence. "Fascinating," the homunculus whispered, his voice carrying harmonic frequencies that spoke to madness given form and purpose. "In studying the unbreakable, I have discovered something even more valuable: the knowledge of what makes cooperation impossible among our kind. And that knowledge, dear Vexthul, belongs to me alone." The Archon's response was immediate and visceral, aristocratic composure giving way to the predatory instincts that had allowed him to survive 3 millennia of Comorog's political warfare. His Kabbalite warriors, who had remained in concealment throughout the torment sessions, emerged from hidden alcoves with splinter rifles already trained on the homunculus's position. Yet even as they moved to secure their master's interests, Zerath's own creatures responded with equal swiftness. Grotesques, those massive constructs of flesh and metal that served as the homunculus coven's heavy infantry, smashed through concealed barriers with roars that spoke to pain given sentience and fury. Their massive fists, enhanced with biomechanical augmentations that could punch through ceramite, swept aside cover that had been positioned to provide tactical advantage for Kabbalite warriors whose primary strength lay in mobility rather than direct confrontation. The chamber transformed from laboratory to battlefield within heartbeats, sophisticated torment equipment becoming improvised weapons as both factions sought to eliminate their former allies while securing exclusive access to the prize that had brought them together. Splinter rounds sparked off crystalline surfaces, while dark lances carved molten furrows through walls that had been crafted from living bone, their destruction releasing screams that belonged to creatures that had died millennia ago, yet somehow remained conscious within the architecture itself. Yet it was in this moment of perfect chaos, when attention was focused entirely upon factional warfare rather than prisoner containment, that Valerian seized the opportunity he had been preparing for since his capture began. The restraints that held him suspended had been designed to adapt to any attempt at conventional escape, their alien alloys shifting to maintain perfect tension regardless of leverage or applied force. But they had not been designed to account for a prisoner who understood their function well enough to exploit their adaptive nature against them. The custodian's enhanced physiology, still functioning despite hours of systematic torment, provided the strength necessary to create precisely calculated stress points within the restraint system. Rather than fighting against their adaptive properties, he worked with them, using their responsiveness to create harmonic vibrations that propagated through the crystalline support structure until the entire apparatus began to resonate at frequencies that threatened structural integrity. The restraints shattered with a sound like breaking stars, dropping Valerian to the laboratory floor, while fragments of exotic materials scattered across surfaces, slick with alien blood. His enhanced reflexes, dulled but not eliminated by the systematic torment he had endured, allowed him to land in a combat stance, despite the weakness that threatened to claim his consciousness. Around him, the battle between Zerath's creatures and Vexthal's warriors reached crescendo, as both sides realized that their prize was no longer secured. Yet neither faction was prepared for what the custodian represented when freed from restraint and motivated by the cold fury that had been building throughout his captivity. This was not merely a warrior seeking escape, but a force of nature that had been given focus and direction by the systematic cruelty he had witnessed. The first grotesque to approach him fell when Valerian's bare hands found purchase on biomechanical joints that had been designed to resist conventional weapons, but not the precise application of knowledge gained through 8 centuries of studying enemy anatomy. Hydraulic systems ruptured under pressure, applied at exactly the right angle, sending the massive creature crashing to the floor, while synthetic blood pooled beneath its convulsing form. A Kabbalite warrior, seeking to claim credit for recapturing the escaped prisoner, discovered that splinter rifle accuracy meant nothing when the target possessed reflexes that bordered on the supernatural. Valerian moved through the weapon's firing pattern like water flowing around stones, his enhanced awareness mapping trajectory and timing until he stood close enough to deliver the ending blow that separated the warrior's head from his shoulders with surgical precision. Yet even as he carved a path of destruction through both factions, Valerian's tactical awareness extended beyond immediate combat to encompass the larger strategic situation that was developing within this section of Comora. The sounds of battle echoed through passages that connected to other domains, drawing attention from cabals and covens that had their own interests in the unprecedented prize that 3 factions had been attempting to claim. Portal fields began opening throughout the laboratory complex as reinforcements arrived from multiple directions, their allegiances unclear, but their intentions obviously hostile to anyone who stood between them and the greatest prize Comora had seen in millennia. Archon Malthar of the Cabal of the Crimson Talon materialized with a retinue of incubi whose power weapons blazed with energies that spoke to mastery of close combat warfare. Homunculus Izara, the Bone Sculptor, emerged from a different portal with pain engines whose mechanical screams added new harmonies to the symphony of destruction that filled the chamber. The laboratory, already damaged by the initial conflict between Zerath and Vex Thul, began to collapse under the strain of hosting a battle between multiple Drukhari factions, whose combined firepower represented enough destructive potential to level city blocks. Crystalline support structures cracked under the impact of dark lance fire, while bio-neural conduits ruptured, spilling exotic fluids that burned through floor plating to expose the twisted machinery that powered this section of the Dark City. In the midst of this chaos, Valerian faced a choice that would define not merely his own survival, but the moral framework that had guided 8 centuries of service to the Emperor of mankind. The laboratory's exit passages lay open before him, their defensive systems disabled by the ongoing battle and their guard positions abandoned as warriors focused on factional combat. Escape was not merely possible but virtually guaranteed, given the confusion that reigned throughout the complex. Yet his enhanced hearing detected sounds that spoke to suffering beyond mere combat casualties. Through the laboratory's twisted architecture, carried on air currents that bore the chemical signatures of fear and despair, came evidence of other prisoners held in chambers throughout this section of Comora. Imperial citizens, space marines, perhaps even other members of the Adeptus Custodes, who had fallen to Drukhari raids over the centuries. The tactical calculus was brutally simple. Individual escape represented the logical choice, the decision that would maximize his own survival while preserving his capabilities for future service to the Imperium. Yet that same calculus ignored moral obligations that transcended strategic necessity, duties to the innocent that had been forged in the same fires that created his genetic modifications and psychological conditioning. 800 years of service, Valerian whispered to himself as he stood amid the carnage, his golden eyes reflecting fires that burned throughout the collapsing laboratory. 8 centuries of oaths that bind me not merely to the Emperor, but to every soul that cannot defend itself. The choice, when it came, was made not with the cold logic that characterized military decision-making, but with the fundamental certainty that had defined his existence since the moment he first knelt before the Golden Throne. Duty was not merely obligation, but identity itself, and identity could not be abandoned simply because circumstances made honor inconvenient. Rather than moving toward the exit passages that promised freedom, Valerian turned toward the sounds of suffering that echoed through the complex's deeper levels. His bare hands claimed weapons from fallen Drukhari as he began moving through chambers where torment had been elevated to an art form whose masterpieces would have driven lesser minds to immediate madness. Behind him, the laboratory continued its collapse as factional warfare consumed the remnants of Zerath's domain. The homunculus himself had retreated to defensive positions, where his most terrible creations provided protection from enemies whose numbers continued to grow as word of the chaos spread throughout Comora. Vexthul had fallen back to his own strongholds, his surviving warriors forming defensive perimeters, while he calculated the political implications of his failure to secure the ultimate prize. Yet neither of them realized that the prize they fought over was no longer interested in escape, but had instead transformed into something far more dangerous. The hunter had become the hunted, but the hunt itself had been redefined according to principles that no Drukhari mind could fully comprehend. Valerian moved through the complex like a golden angel of retribution, his presence transforming chambers of despair into scenes of liberation that would be whispered about in the deepest corners of Comora for generations to come. The real battle was only beginning, and its outcome would determine far more than the fate of a single custodian. In the darkness of the Dark City, hope had taken physical form and armed itself with the fury of the righteous. The hunt was about to become something entirely different. Chapter 9. The Golden Fury. The deeper chambers of Comorag's torment complex revealed themselves to Valerian like the pages of a heretical text, whose contents were written in suffering and despair. Each passage he traversed echoed with the screams of the damned, while bioluminescent panels cast sickly light across walls that wept tears of blood from victims whose agony had been literally incorporated into the architecture itself. Yet rather than breaking his spirit, these horrors only strengthened his resolve to transform this place of torment into something the Dark City had never experienced, a scene of genuine liberation. His first improvised weapon came from the body of a Kabbalite warrior whose neck he had broken during his escape from the laboratory. The splinter rifle felt crude compared to his guardian spear, its alien design optimized for inflicting slow death rather than clean ends. But in Valerian's enhanced hands, it became an instrument of surgical precision. Each shot found gaps in Drukhari armor with mathematical accuracy, while his enhanced reflexes allowed him to anticipate return fire before enemy fingers could complete their trigger pulls. The armor came piece by piece, salvaged from fallen enemies, and modified through techniques that drew upon 8 centuries of experience in battlefield improvisation. A Kabbalite's torso plate, reinforced with metal strips torn from wall fixtures. Arm guards from an incubi's war gear, their power fields rewired to provide enhanced protection despite their alien origin. Boot plates from a fallen homunculus acolyte, their biomechanical components providing the enhanced mobility that would prove crucial in the running battles to come. Yet it was not merely equipment that transformed Valerian from escaped prisoner to force of nature, but rather the fundamental shift in purpose that occurred when duty superseded personal survival. Each chamber he entered became a tactical challenge to be solved, each group of guards an obstacle to be eliminated with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to the captives they were meant to contain. The first slave pen revealed itself through the chemical signatures of fear and desperation that his enhanced senses detected long before visual contact. Imperial citizens, survivors of raids that spanned decades, huddled in conditions that would have driven baseline humans to madness within days. Yet their eyes still held sparks of humanity, flames that blazed brighter when they beheld the golden giant who smashed through their prison's defenses with the fury of an avenging angel. "Citizens of the Imperium," Valerian announced, as his improvised weapons eliminated the last of their guards, his voice carrying clearly through air, thick with the chemical residue of alien torment devices. "I am Shield Captain Valerian Aurelius of the Adeptus Custodes. Your suffering ends now." The liberation proceeded with military precision despite the chaos that surrounded it. Valerian's tactical awareness encompassed not merely the immediate threat posed by Drukhari reinforcements, but also the psychological state of prisoners whose minds had been broken by experiences that transcended normal categories of cruelty. Some required direct assistance to comprehend that rescue was genuine rather than another form of torment. Others needed weapons and guidance to channel their rage into effective combat capability. Yet even as he organized the growing rebellion, Valerian remained acutely aware of the pursuing forces that sought to reclaim their most valuable prize. Zerath's bioconstructs tracked him through passages that had been designed as mazes, their enhanced senses following chemical traces that no amount of misdirection could completely obscure. The homunculus himself followed close behind, his mechanical appendages armed with weapons that represented the pinnacle of his twisted artistry. The first major confrontation came in a gladiatorial arena whose sands had been soaked with the blood of 10,000 combats, its crystalline walls designed to amplify the screams of the dying for the entertainment of audiences whose appetites had been refined by millennia of exposure to every conceivable form of suffering. Zerath emerged from hidden passages with a retinue of his most terrible creations, pain engines whose mechanical screams harmonized with the arena's acoustic properties to create sensory assault weapons that could drive enemies to madness through pure sonic bombardment. Valerian met the charge with a calm that transcended mere tactical awareness to become something approaching divine certainty. His improvised weapons, a power sword claimed from a fallen archon, and a storm bolter stripped from a Kabbalite trueborn, blazed with energies that seemed to burn brighter in response to the surrounding darkness. Each shot and stroke was calculated for maximum effect, targeting structural weak points in biomechanical constructs whose alien design principles had been analyzed and catalogued during his hours of systematic torment. The pain engine that led Zerath's assault fell when Valerian's power sword found the bio-neural conduit that connected its mechanical systems to the still-living brain that served as its central processor. The massive construct collapsed with a death scream that shattered crystal viewing panels, while synthetic blood pooled beneath its convulsing form. Its destruction sent shock waves through the remaining creatures, biomechanical systems that had been synchronized with their leader's neural patterns, suddenly finding themselves operating without central coordination. Yet even as he carved through Zerath's forces, Valerian's enhanced awareness detected new threats converging on the arena from multiple directions. Vexthul had called in favors from allied cabals, their warriors pouring through portal networks that connected distant parts of Comera in ways that defied conventional geometry. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as overwhelming numbers began to offset individual superiority in skill and equipment. It was the freed prisoners who provided the solution to what seemed an impossible tactical problem. Imperial citizens who had been broken by years of systematic torment found purpose in supporting the Golden Warrior who had given them hope for the first time since their capture. They could not match Drukhari warriors in skill or equipment, but they possessed something their enemies had long forgotten, the willingness to sacrifice themselves for something greater than personal survival. "For the Emperor!" The battle cry echoed through the arena as human prisoners charged into combat against alien captors, their crude weapons and improvised armor, no match for splinter rifles and power weapons, but their moral certainty providing advantages that transcended mere material considerations. Each Imperial citizen who fell took down multiple enemies through tactics that emphasized mutual support over individual glory, creating the kind of coordinated resistance that Drukhari warriors, trained primarily for raids against defenseless populations, were poorly equipped to handle. The battle spread beyond the arena as word of the uprising reached other parts of the complex. Slave revolts erupted in chambers throughout the facility as imprisoned space marines, their own genetic modifications providing superhuman capabilities, despite years of systematic torment, broke free from restraints that had been designed to hold baseline humans. Adeptus Mechanicus Tech Adepts, their mechanical augmentations, still functional despite alien attempts at modification, turned captured Drukhari technology against its creators with devastating effectiveness. Valerian moved through this chaos like a figure from ancient legend, his golden armor blazing with reflected fire while his weapons carved paths of liberation through passages that had known only suffering for millennia. Each chamber he entered became a rallying point for resistance, each group of freed prisoners adding their strength to a rebellion that grew stronger with every victory against their former captors. Yet the true test came when Vexthul himself entered the battle, the Archon's aristocratic composure finally cracking as he witnessed the systematic destruction of everything he had worked centuries to achieve. The alien noble fought with the desperate fury of someone who understood that failure would mean not merely death, but the kind of lingering torment that made death seem merciful by comparison. "You have cost me everything," Vexthul snarled as his power weapon clashed against Valerian's improvised blade, sparks cascading through air, thick with the smoke of burning bioarchitecture. 3,000 years of careful planning, decades of preparation for this single opportunity, all undone by one stubborn fool who refuses to acknowledge the inevitability of his own destruction. Valerian's response came not in words, but in the relentless pressure of combat technique, refined through 8 centuries of warfare against every conceivable enemy. The Archon was skilled, his movements carrying the fluid grace that marked a master of Drukhari combat doctrine, but skill alone could not overcome the fundamental difference between a warrior who fought for personal glory and one who fought for principles that transcended the self. The end came when Vexthul attempted an ending blow that would have succeeded against any normal opponent, his power weapon carving through the air in an arc that should have separated Valerian's head from his shoulders. Yet the Custodian's enhanced reflexes allowed him to transform what appeared to be inevitable defeat into the opening that decided the battle's outcome. His return stroke found the gap between the Archon's armor plates with surgical precision, the improvised blade piercing alien flesh to find the dual hearts that sustained Vexthul's unnatural existence. The aristocratic features that had commanded respect throughout Comora's treacherous hierarchy froze in an expression of disbelief as 3 millennia of political maneuvering came to an end on the dark-stained sands of an arena that had witnessed 10,000 deaths, but never one quite like this. As Vexthul's body collapsed, Valerian stood amid the carnage and chaos of a battle that had transformed from rescue mission into full-scale rebellion. Around him, freed prisoners continued their assault on Drukhari positions, while bioarchitecture burned with fires that cast dancing shadows across walls that had been constructed from the ossified remains of countless victims. Yet even in victory, the Custodian's enhanced senses detected signs that the battle was far from over. Zerath remained somewhere in the complex's depths, his obsession with understanding the unbreakable driving him to increasingly desperate measures as he witnessed the systematic destruction of his life's work. More cabals were converging on the facility as news of the uprising spread through Comora's communication networks, their leaders drawn by the prospect of claiming whatever remained of the ultimate prize. The rebellion had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation, but survival would require more than tactical victories. It would require the kind of strategic thinking that could transform a successful escape into a legend that would echo through the dark city's twisted corridors for generations to come. Valerian raised his battered weapon toward the chamber's vaulted ceiling, his voice carrying clearly over the sounds of continuing battle as he addressed the freed prisoners who had chosen to fight rather than flee. "This is only the beginning," he declared, his words carrying the weight of prophecy backed by absolute conviction. "Today we do more than escape. Today we remind the galaxy that hope exists even in the darkest places." The hunt was entering its final phase, and the prey had become the predator in ways that would reshape the very nature of what it meant to challenge the Emperor's chosen. Chapter 10. The Three Deaths. The echoes of Vex Thul's final scream still reverberated through the gladiatorial arena as Valerian stood among the carnage, his improvised armor gleaming with alien blood, while freed prisoners continued their systematic destruction of Drukhari positions throughout the complex. 2 of his 3 original captors lay dead, their bodies serving as monuments to the price of underestimating the Emperor's chosen. Nithara had fallen chapters ago, her perfect features frozen in eternal disbelief, while the Archon's aristocratic ambitions had met their end on these very sands moments before. Yet even as victory seemed within reach, Valerian's enhanced senses detected the approaching presence of the one tormentor, whose obsession transcended mere political calculation or predatory satisfaction. Zerath came not as conqueror seeking to reclaim a prize, but as a mad scientist whose life's work had been reduced to ashes by the very subject he had sought to understand. The homunculus emerged from the arena's lower levels like a figure from humanity's deepest nightmares, his mechanical appendages carrying weapons that represented millennia of refinement in the art of inflicting suffering. "Magnificent," Zerath whispered, his modified voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself recoil in horror as he surveyed the destruction that surrounded Valerian's position. "Absolutely magnificent. Do you see what you have accomplished, my dear subject? In breaking free, you have validated everything I believed about the nature of consciousness itself. You are not merely unbreakable. You are transformative." The homunculus gestured, and the arena's architecture began to shift around them, hidden mechanisms revealing themselves as crystalline walls retracted to expose chambers that had been concealed beneath the gladiatorial sands. What emerged from those depths defied rational categorization, creatures that existed at the intersection of nightmare and scientific methodology, whose very presence seemed to drain light from the surrounding air. The first wave consisted of bioconstructs that had once been space marines, their enhanced physiology twisted through techniques that violated every natural law while preserving just enough consciousness to ensure they remained aware of what they had become. Power armor had been fused directly with flesh through biomechanical integration, while weapons had been grafted to limbs in ways that made them extensions of the nervous system rather than mere tools. Valerian met their charge with the cold fury that had sustained him through every trial since his capture began, his power sword carved through corrupted ceramite with surgical precision, while his storm bolter spoke death in precise, measured bursts that found gaps in defenses that should have been impenetrable. Yet even as he destroyed these abominations, he felt something twist within his consciousness at the recognition of what they had once been. Brothers in arms whose only crime had been falling into Drukhari hands. "You feel it, don't you?" Zerath called out over the sounds of battle, his mechanical appendages making minute adjustments to control systems that regulated the flow of combat. The weight of knowledge, the burden of understanding what suffering truly means when inflicted with scientific precision rather than mere cruelty. They were heroes once, these creatures, space marines who believed their enhanced physiology would protect them from corruption. I have proven them wrong. The second wave brought horrors that challenged Valyrian sanity in ways that mere physical combat could never achieve. Custodians, or what had once been custodians, their golden armor blackened and twisted through biomechanical modification that had transformed the Emperor's finest into living monuments to the futility of resistance. Their move yet even this triumph paled before the challenge that Xerath himself represented as the homunculus finally entered direct combat, his form revealing modifications that had been accumulating for millennia until he barely resembled anything that had once belonged to the Eldar species. Additional arms sprouted from his torso, each terminating in a different weapon or surgical instrument, while his legs had been replaced with mechanical spider limbs that could navigate any terrain with perfect stability. Each exchange of blows carried implications that extended far beyond immediate survival. When Valyrian's power sword met Xerath's biomechanical claws, sparks that flew from the impact seemed to illuminate questions about the nature of consciousness itself. When the homunculus's pain inducers struck enhanced armor, the resulting feedback challenged every assumption about the relationship between mind and body. Yet as the battle progressed, Valyrian began to recognize patterns in his opponent's approach that revealed fundamental weaknesses hidden beneath layers of technological sophistication. Xerath's modifications had been accumulated over millennia without coherent planning, each edition addressing specific tactical needs without consideration for overall integration. The result was a being of immense capability, whose components worked against each other as often as they cooperated. The end impossible, the homunculus whispered as his life drained away, mechanical appendages falling still while his ancient eyes fixed upon Valyrian's golden gaze. The data, the analysis, everything indicated that consciousness could be reduced to component elements. That identity existed only in neural patterns that could be mapped and modified. How can you remain unchanged? How can you still be you? Valyrian's response carried the weight of absolute certainty, backed by 8 centuries of unwavering faith. Because some things exist beyond your ability to measure them. Duty, honor, love of something greater than the self. These are not mere neural patterns to be catalogued and modified. They are choices that define what we are, and choices cannot be taken from us no matter what torments you inflict upon the flesh that houses them. As Xerath's eyes dimmed and his modified form collapsed to the arena floor, Valyrian stood as the last figure moving in a scene of unprecedented carnage. All 3 of his original captors lay dead, their ambitions reduced to nothing, while the rebellion they had inadvertently sparked continued to rage throughout the complex. The Emperor's chosen had proven unbreakable not through superior genetics or enhanced conditioning, but through the simple power of a will that served purposes greater than personal survival. The 3 deaths marked more than the end of individual lives. They represented the destruction of methodologies that had been refined over millennia, the failure of approaches that had never before encountered resistance that could not eventually be overcome. In the heart of Comora itself, hope had triumphed over despair through the simple expedient of refusing to accept that triumph was impossible. Yet even in victory, Valyrian knew that the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The power vacuum created by the systematic elimination of Xerath, Vex-Thul, and Nithara had transformed the complex from ordered brutality into chaotic warfare, as rival factions moved to claim territories that had suddenly become available for conquest. Through the bioarchitecture's organic conduits came the sounds of splinter rifle fire and the mechanical screams of pain engines as cabals fought homunculus covens, while witch cults played all sides against each other in pursuit of maximum carnage. Valerian led his growing company of survivors through this maze of competing ambitions with tactical awareness that drew upon 8 centuries of experience in warfare across every conceivable battlefield. Yet never before had he commanded forces whose capabilities ranged from Imperial Guard veterans, whose skills remained sharp despite years of captivity, to baseline citizens whose only qualifications for combat were desperation and the weapons they had claimed from fallen enemies. "Stay in formation," he commanded, as they moved through a passage whose walls wept tears of blood from victims whose suffering had been literally incorporated into the architecture. "Watch your spacing. Trust your neighbors. We are no longer prisoners seeking escape. We are an Imperial force conducting a fighting withdrawal through hostile territory." The words carried weight that transcended mere tactical instruction, transforming a desperate flight into something approaching military precision. Imperial Guard sergeants who had maintained their discipline through years of systematic torment found themselves organizing squads from whatever personnel were available. Space Marines whose conditioning had preserved their tactical awareness despite alien modifications began coordinating with Adeptus Mechanicus tech adepts whose mechanical augmentations provided capabilities that complemented enhanced superhuman reflexes. Yet Valerian's tactical brilliance transformed what should have been a defeat into a masterclass in defensive warfare conducted with minimal resources against superior numbers. He positioned his most capable fighters at choke points, where their enhanced abilities could offset numerical disadvantage, while using baseline humans as mobile reserves whose unexpected competence disrupted enemy tactical calculations. "Enfilade fire from the left corridor," he called out, as his enhanced senses detected movement patterns that indicated flanking maneuvers. "Tech Adept Varians, can your servo skulls provide overwatch on our rear approach?" The battle flowed through chambers whose purpose had been to inflict suffering, but which now became scenes of liberation as Imperial forces carved through alien enemies with the fury of those who had finally found worthy targets for their accumulated rage. Yet victory came at a price that weighed heavily upon Valerian's conscience as he witnessed the fall of beings he had personally freed from captivity only hours before. Sergeant Mordian, a veteran of the Cadian shock troops, whose tactical competence had proven invaluable in organizing civilian survivors, fell when a dark lance pierced the improvised cover that had protected his position throughout the battle. His last words were instructions to his squad about maintaining their fire pattern, duty persisting even as life faded from eyes that had seen too much suffering to count mere death as significant. Tech Adept Varians, whose mechanical augmentations had provided crucial support through her control of salvaged Drukhari technology, collapsed when splinter toxins finally overwhelmed immune systems that had been weakened by years of systematic poisoning. Her servo skulls continued their programmed patterns for precious minutes after her death, mechanical loyalty outlasting the consciousness that had given it purpose. Each loss struck Valerian with force that seemed to accumulate rather than diminish, the weight of responsibility for beings whose suffering had ended, only to culminate in heroic deaths that should have been unnecessary if he had possessed the tactical awareness to anticipate every possible threat. The mathematics of warfare demanded acceptable casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives, yet mathematics provided no comfort when those casualties possessed names and faces and personal histories that had been shaped by unimaginable torments. "Shield Captain," called out Brother Marine Thaddeus, whose power armor bore the colors of the Iron Hands, despite modifications that spoke to years of alien experimentation. "Movement ahead. Large force. Multiple factions. They're fighting each other, but our approach will put us in their engagement zone." Valerian's enhanced vision pierced through smoke and chemical haze to assess the tactical situation that blocked their path to freedom. 3 separate Drukhari forces had converged in the chamber ahead, their mutual hostility temporarily suspended by the greater prize that liberation represented. Cabal warriors from at least 2 different factions worked alongside homunculus creatures, while witch cults provided mobile harassment that kept all parties focused on immediate threats rather than larger strategic considerations. The tactical calculus was brutally simple. Direct engagement would result in casualties that his force could not afford, while attempting to bypass the combat zone would expose them to flanking attacks from enemies whose mobility far exceeded their own capabilities. Yet retreat was not an option, as pursuit forces from their previous engagement had sealed the passages behind them. It was Brother Marine Koreth of the Salamanders who provided the solution that tactical orthodoxy could never have generated. "Shield, Captain," he said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to genetic modifications that remained functional despite years of alien torment. "The power conduits that feed this section's bioarchitecture run through that chamber. If we could overload them..." The plan that emerged from desperate necessity was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. The complex's bioarchitecture drew power from reactors whose output had been refined through technologies that predated the fall of the Eldar Empire, systems whose failure would result in cascading explosions that might well consume everything within several city blocks. Yet such destruction would also create the chaos necessary for escape, while eliminating threats that could pursue them through whatever path they managed to find. The demolition proceeded with military precision despite the improvised nature of their equipment and the ongoing combat that raged mere corridors away. Tech-adept Karax, whose augmentations included interfaces that could penetrate alien control systems, worked with fevered intensity to bypass safeguards that had been designed to prevent exactly this sort of sabotage. Space Marines provided security, while Imperial Guard veterans organized defensive positions that could hold long enough for the technical work to be completed. Yet it was during these crucial final moments that Valerian's enhanced sensors detected the most significant discovery of their entire escape attempt. Through the chemical signatures that his modified biology could analyze with precision beyond any technological instrument, he detected traces that spoke to Imperial presence nearby. Not prisoners, but something far more valuable. A webway portal that connected to passages leading toward Imperial space. "There," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly over the sounds of approaching combat. 2 chambers down the main corridor, behind the biothermal regulation station. Webway portal, recently active, trajectory consistent with passage toward the Ultima Segmentum. The portal represented salvation in its most literal sense, a path that could carry his survivors home to Imperial space, where their testimonies about Drukhari capabilities would provide intelligence valuable beyond measure. Yet reaching it would require fighting through the main chamber, where 3 separate enemy forces continued their factional warfare, and holding it long enough for every survivor to pass through safely. The final battle began when Karax triggered the overload sequence that sent power surges through conduits whose biomechanical components began to convulse with harmonics that spoke to pain given technological form. Emergency lighting bathed the chamber in crimson radiance, while alarm systems shrieked warnings in languages that predated human civilization. The Drukhari factions, suddenly confronted with imminent destruction of their immediate environment, turned their attention from factional warfare to the Imperial forces whose presence had become impossible to ignore. Valerian led the charge into that maelstrom of alien fury, with weapons that blazed like golden stars in the chamber's hellish illumination. His power sword carved through splinter rifle volleys, while his storm bolter spoke death with mechanical precision that found targets despite the chaos surrounding them. Around him, Imperial forces followed with the desperate courage of beings who had glimpsed freedom and would accept any price to claim it. The fighting was beyond brutal, transcending normal categories of combat to become something approaching divine judgment rendered through mortal instruments. Space Marines, whose genetic modifications had survived years of torment, fought with the fury of demigods unleashed, while Imperial Guard veterans proved that baseline human courage could achieve results that rivaled superhuman capability when properly motivated. Yet even as they carved a path through alien resistance, Valerian felt his enhanced physiology finally approaching the limits that even custodian conditioning could not transcend. Blood loss from accumulated wounds, combined with exhaustion, that spoke to reserves depleted beyond safe margins, while his nervous system began showing signs of stress that indicated systematic breakdown was imminent. The portal chamber lay before them, its crystalline structure pulsing with energies that promised passage to Imperial space. Yet Drukhari reinforcements continued to pour through side passages, their numbers apparently endless as more factions were drawn to the chaos that the complex's imminent destruction was creating. "Go," Valerian commanded as he positioned himself at the chamber's primary entrance, his weapons trained on approaches that would allow enemy forces to reach the portal before all survivors had passed through to safety. "I will hold this position." The tactical necessity was undeniable, yet every survivor who passed through that portal carried with them the weight of understanding what their salvation cost. The Emperor's chosen, greatest of humanity's warriors, stood alone against a tide of alien fury, so that beings he had rescued from torment could find their way home to tell the story of what had happened in this place of ultimate darkness. The price of gold had been measured not merely in blood, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything in service of something greater than personal survival. Chapter 12. The Unbroken Shield. The webway portal blazed with energies that spoke to salvation, measured in heartbeats and blood, its crystalline structure pulsing with harmonics that grew more urgent as Drukhari forces converged on Valerian's position. Behind him, the last of the liberated prisoners passed through that gateway between dimensions, their voices calling his name with desperate entreaties that he follow them to safety. Yet the shield captain remained at his post, golden armor cracked and battered, but still gleaming with reflected light, his improvised weapons speaking death in measured cadences that held back a tide of alien fury. When the portal finally collapsed, its energies exhausted by the passage of Imperial souls toward freedom, Valerian stood alone in a chamber whose walls ran red with the blood of enemies who had learned too late what it meant to challenge the Emperor's chosen. His enhanced physiology had finally reached limits that even custodian conditioning could not transcend, wounds and exhaustion combining to drag him toward unconsciousness that promised either rest or death. Yet it was not death that claimed him in those final moments, but rather something far more remarkable. Through passages still echoing with the sounds of Drukhari factional warfare came the golden light of salvation rendered in human form. His shield host brothers, following traces through the webway that only custodian senses could detect, arrived in time to witness the aftermath of a liberation that would be whispered about in the deepest corners of Comora for generations to come. "Valerian!" Shield Captain Carthan's voice carried clearly over the chemical stench of alien blood and burning bioarchitecture, his tone mixing relief with the kind of awe that marked recognition of deeds that transcended normal categories of heroism. We have been searching for you across 3 sectors and a dozen worlds. The rescue proceeded with military efficiency, despite the chaos that surrounded them, custodian medical protocols preserving life that hung by threads, while extraction procedures carried their wounded brother away from a realm where hope was meant to die in darkness. The journey back to Imperial space passed in periods of consciousness punctuated by medical interventions that drew upon 10 millennia of accumulated knowledge about preserving enhanced human physiology under extreme conditions. Terra welcomed its returning son, with ceremonies appropriate to one who had ventured into the heart of darkness and emerged carrying proof that some things could never be broken, regardless of what torments were applied to test their limits. The medical facilities beneath the Imperial Palace, equipped with technology that represented the pinnacle of human achievement, worked for weeks to repair damage that transcended mere physical injury to encompass psychological trauma that would have destroyed lesser minds. Yet when the diagnostics were complete and the healing had progressed as far as science could achieve, the results confirmed what those who knew Valerian had never doubted. His mind remained pure, his loyalty absolute, his purpose unchanged by experiences that had redefined what it meant to endure suffering in service of a higher cause. The systematic torment that had been designed to break his will had instead revealed the fundamental truth that lay at the heart of custodian conditioning, that some bonds could not be severed regardless of what forces were brought to bear against them. The audience with Captain General Valoris took place in the chamber of the Guardian's vigil, where golden light from sacred braziers cast shadows that seemed to dance with the memories of 10,000 years of faithful service. The master of the Adeptus Custodes listened without interruption as Valerian delivered his report, each detail catalogued with the precision that marked a mind trained to analyze and remember everything that might prove tactically significant. "The intelligence you have gathered," Valoris said when the recitation was complete, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to authority earned through millennia of flawless service, "will prove invaluable in protecting Imperial citizens from similar raids. Yet the greater victory lies not in what you learned, but in what you proved. In the deepest pits of Comarag itself, the Emperor's will proved stronger than every torment their twisted science could devise." The return to active duty came with new scars that spoke to trials no other custodian had endured, marks that would serve as permanent reminders of time spent in hell and the price paid for refusing to surrender principles that defined what it meant to serve something greater than personal survival. Yet those scars were worn with pride rather than shame, evidence that even the most perfect warriors could be tested beyond normal limits and emerge stronger rather than broken. The liberated Imperial citizens who had witnessed Valerian's sacrifice became living testimonies to custodian dedication, their accounts spreading through Imperial space with the authority of those who had seen the Emperor's chosen hold true to sacred oaths, regardless of personal cost. Children who had been rescued from Drukhari slave pens grew to adulthood carrying stories of the golden giant who had walked through hell itself to bring them home, while space marines who had fought alongside him spoke in reverent tones of tactical genius that transformed desperate escape into coordinated rebellion. Yet perhaps the most significant impact was felt not in Imperial space, but in the twisted spires of Comarag itself, where the legend of the Golden Death began to spread through whispered conversations conducted in chambers where even the boldest predators felt compelled to speak quietly. Drukhari, who had survived the destruction of Zerath's complex, told stories of an Imperial warrior who could not be broken, whose resistance had grown stronger with every torment applied until he became something that transcended normal categories of enemy to become a force of nature itself. The psychological impact rippled through cabal hierarchies and homunculus covens, whose confidence in their methods had been shaken by contact with something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and will. Raids against imperial targets became more cautious as commanders who had never known fear found themselves contemplating the possibility that their intended victims might include beings whose dedication transcended anything their science could analyze or overcome. In the months that followed, Valerian resumed his duties with the same dedication that had marked 8 centuries of faithful service, his presence in the imperial palace serving as a living reminder that some things remained constant regardless of how much darkness the galaxy might contain. Yet those who served alongside him recognized subtle changes that spoke to experiences beyond normal comprehension, a depth of understanding about the nature of duty that could only be gained through trials that tested every assumption about what it meant to remain loyal when loyalty itself became a form of suffering. The liberated prisoners, scattered across imperial space to resume lives that had been interrupted by alien cruelty, carried with them more than mere memories of rescue. They carried proof that the Imperium's promises about protection and justice were not mere propaganda, but living truths embodied by warriors whose dedication extended beyond death itself. In barrack rooms and factory floors, in hab blocks and cathedral spires, the story was told and retold until it became part of the great tapestry of human endurance that defined what it meant to survive in a galaxy where darkness pressed against every source of light. Yet perhaps the deepest impact was felt not in grand gestures or public ceremonies, but in quiet moments when duty called, and those who served remembered that somewhere in the galaxy walked a warrior who had proven that no amount of suffering could break bonds forged in the fires of absolute faith. When Imperial guards faced impossible odds, when Space Marines stood against overwhelming darkness, when ordinary citizens chose courage over surrender, they carried with them the knowledge that the Emperor's protection extended even into places where hope was meant to die. In the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace, chroniclers recorded the events for posterity, while analysts studied tactical implications that would inform defensive strategies for generations to come. Yet the true lesson of Valerian's ordeal could not be captured in tactical manuals or strategic assessments. It lay in the simple truth that some things existed beyond the reach of corruption, that loyalty freely given could not be taken by force, and that the human spirit, properly tempered, could endure anything the galaxy might devise to test its limits. The Golden Warrior returned to his eternal vigil, bearing scars that spoke to trials beyond imagining, yet his presence served as proof that some shields could never be broken, regardless of what forces were brought against them. In the grim darkness of the far future, where war consumed worlds and hope was measured in heartbeats, there walked still those whose dedication transcended every attempt to corrupt or destroy it. The Emperor's will endured, carried forward by warriors who had proven themselves unbreakable, not through superior genetics or enhanced conditioning, but through the simple power of choosing duty over comfort, service over safety, and faith over despair. In the deepest darkness, the golden light continued to burn, tended by those whose loyalty could not be purchased, corrupted, or destroyed. There was no end to the vigil. There was only service, eternal and unbroken, a shield of gold standing guard against the night.